Professor Petrus de Vries. I'm from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and today I'm sitting in the Belfast City Hospital in Northern Ireland. The last time, or in fact the first time I was in Belfast was in 1998, so it was delightful for me to be back 21 years later for us to have another Tuberous Sclerosis Association family conference. These are my favorite kinds of conferences because we bring together families who live with TSC and bring their lived expertise together with professionals who support families. And I think that's the best way for us to bring knowledge and to share knowledge around how to improve our lives with TSC. The specific focus of our meeting today is not so much on the physical manifestations of TSC, the kidney and the epilepsy and the skin and all those kind of things, but in fact on TAND. And TAND stands for TSC-Associated Neuropsychiatric disorders. Because the simple message is that TAND, for most people who live with tuberous sclerosis, actually cause the greatest burden, the greatest concern. Because TAND include a huge range of things, including a range of behavioral challenges, a range of psychiatric disorders, intellectual difficulties, academic issues in school, neuropsychological deficits, and a huge range of psychosocial issues. So we had a wonderful program together of a range of experts who talked about what TAND is, practical support for autism, for academic issues, for school, and a wonderful group of families and professionals who were here today. I really hope that the materials that we've recorded as well will be useful to people, including those who were not able to be with us today in the meeting. Thank you very much for everyone who's supporting people who live with TSC and for people who support the Tuberous Sclerosis Association in their exciting task. Patrick was there, you guys were there, Charlie Shepherd was there. That was my first one. And people like Anne Hunt, some of you might remember Anne Hunt, Janet Metcalf, and some of the older generation of TSA people were there. So the number 21 is obviously a theme for today. So this is my 21st anniversary of coming to Belfast for a TSC family meeting. So great to be here and lovely to be able to spend the day with all of you. I'm going to start by just saying greetings from beautiful Cape Town. So here you can see a picture of the University of Cape Town, where I'm based now. And how many of you have been to Cape Town? Good, a few. The rest of you are welcome. Everyone keeps asking me, why don't you do a TSC conference in Cape Town? Because then we will all come. So here's Table Mountain. There you can see the kind of upper campus buildings of the University of Cape Town, where I'm based. And right here in the front, this is the Rondebosch Common. These are the buildings of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. So this is where I work. And we have some outpatient buildings and some inpatient buildings. And my office is right there. And this is the view from my office. We deliberately, on a site that tries not to look like a hospital, because I think it's less scary for most people. So it's like buildings, like houses. So this is the main clinical building, and I'm in the clinic building just opposite that. But many of you will also know that before I went back to South Africa in 2012, I was actually in Cambridge for 20 years. And so it was in Cambridge that my TSC story started. I had done psychiatry training. I knew that I wanted to do a PhD or academic training, and so I looked for a research theme or a research project at the time. I was interested in neuropsychiatry. I was interested in the growing brain and what goes wrong with it and what we can do about that. But I didn't have a particular theme of focus at the time. And a colleague of mine then said to me, well, aren't you interested in genetic and brainy things? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, my husband is going to advertise a research training fellowship in tuberous sclerosis. And I remember very well saying, TSC, tuberous sclerosis. I kind of knew as much what was that nursing textbook, you know, genetic disorder, brain tumors, epilepsy. In those days we used the word mental retardation. That's kind of all that the book said. That's all I knew about it as well. But that was the start of my journey. So here we are 21, 22 years later, and I'm still doing TSC work. And it's been probably, well, it has been the most rewarding part of all my research activities and clinical activities over the last 21 years. So that's the story. I also wanted to start by showing you this picture today. This is a photograph of a woman called Lauren Ecclesio, Dr. Lauren Ecclesio. She was a research psychologist, and she was a member of my team. And Lauren, you can see this beautiful, smiley woman, is the person who has done most of the work on the TAND checklist, which I'm going to talk about with me. So she did her master's degree in it, she did her PhD working on it. And this picture was taken in Leiden in 2017, when she presented her findings at an international conference. And so Lauren was really the one who contributed a lot over the last 7 years to the TSC story and to the TAND story. She had got malignant melanoma, and she died almost exactly a year ago, age 36, 2 young children, beautiful husband. And so this is not to make you sad at the start of our meeting, but really just to say that I want us to have the whole day and the whole meeting as a celebration for the work that she has done, and as a recognition for the amazing work that people do. And I'll come back to say something about Lauren when we wrap up. Yeah. So this day is for Lauren. Now, I'm not going to do all the talking, so I thought let's start with a bit of a quiz for all of you. Start with an easy one. What does TAND mean? Is it A, the Afrikaans word for a tooth? Is it B, the Austrian word for beautiful but useless? Or does it stand for TSC-Associated Neuropsychiatric Disorders? Who knows the answer?
TSC-Associated Neuropsychiatric.
Is she right? It's actually all three. Yeah, it is the Afrikaans word for a tooth. It's also the Dutch word for a tooth. And apparently it's the Austrian word for beautiful but useless. Now I always say, I'm hoping that the concept will not just be beautiful but useless to us in the TSC community, but I thought that was quite funny. I'm always worried when I go to a country that speaks a different language that TAND might mean something really rude, because then we will be really stuck. Fortunately, so far it hasn't. Question number 2. When we surveyed people, and in fact it was in the TSA, in the UK TSA membership, about 1,500 people in, when was it, early 2000s, or in fact 2010, that's not that long ago. How many of them do you think had ever received any assessment or any treatment for TAND? Which do you think, 18, 38 or 68?
18.
Is that because you know? You're being pessimistic, right? Okay. But you are right. It was 18%. So fewer than 1 in 5 people actually had any kind of assessment. Slightly more difficult. In the Tosca study, how many of you are aware of the Tosca study? So it's a big international cohort of individuals with TSC all over the world, 31 countries. We have just over 2,000 people in this study, and we followed them all up every year for a period of 5 years. So in the Tosca study, what age do you think was autism spectrum disorder typically diagnosed? Was it 3, 5, or 7? 7. Is that, did I hear a 5 and a 7? Is that because you want to be pessimistic?
No, I just think most of these things start to be picked up when the child's at school.
When are we ideally wanting to diagnose autism? As early as possible.
Yeah.
And if we can catch them before 3, the chances are much better to shift trajectories. Yeah. The answer is 7. It was 7. In an international cohort of expert centers who work with TSC, right? So that's a little scary, I think, for us. Can we treat TAND? Yes, no, don't know. The psychiatrists are saying yes, that's very encouraging. Yeah, it's a tricky, and we'll come back to this. And in fact, in the second half, we'll talk a lot about interventions and what we can do. So let's talk about this thing called TAND. And Rachel has sort of already hinted at why we decided to make up this term and sort of what it means, but let me just go through it so that we're all clear exactly what we did and why we did this whole story around TAND. And then I'll talk a bit about the TAND checklist, and some TAND research, and then in the second half, after lunch, we'll talk more about intervention. So this is more to set the scene, and then we'll come back to interventions after that. So why did we create this whole concept of TAND? Well, as you heard from Rachel, all the studies that we've done so far, if we look at people with TSC, 9 out of 10 people with TSC will have some neuropsychiatric or psychiatric or mental health related issues at some point in their life. 9 out of 10. In fact, I don't think I've met one person with TSC who hasn't had any significant mental health, neurodevelopmental or related issue. So it basically is something that affects everyone with TSC in some way. And yet, as you've seen from that study that we did here, most people never had any kind of evaluation or any kind of assessment. And so usually what happens is they come to clinical service or attention when they are severely affected, when they're profoundly affected, when things are desperate. And that's the last time that we want to try and support people who have any kind of mental health or neurodevelopmental problem. And the third reason was there was very significant confusion in the medical community, in the clinical community, about terminology, about language. People in different disciplines use different words to refer to things. And sometimes we use the same word to refer to different things and different words to refer to the same thing. So I'm going to show you some words, and I want you to tell me which of these words you use or which of these words you've used. Cognition, cognitive, yeah? People talk about cognitive, they talk about neurocognition, neurocognitive, neurobehavioral, neuropsychological, psychiatric, mental health, neurodevelopmental, learning, intellectual. People I know in the UK, people still use learning difficulty, learning disability, learning differences, cognitive issues, on track, off track. Tell me more words. How many of these words do people use or have you heard used? Yeah? And they mean different things to different people. And they mean different things to different professional groups as well. And so that was a real problem because we realized we're dealing with a multi-professional community of people in TSC and families from all over the world, and people got confused when they talked about different things. And so that was the other main reason why we wanted to standardize the language and the terminology in the TSC community. And who was it? Claire? I think it was Claire who said, oh, but the principles actually apply to all conditions, and it's true. So the things we're going to talk about are not unique to TSC. They might be relevant just as much to Fragile X and neurofibromatosis and other things, but we developed this with TSC in mind, and we prioritize it for people with TSC. We can talk more about that later. And so that's why we came up with this word, TAND, TSC-Associated Neuropsychiatric Disorders, and we grouped it and we said TAND is an umbrella term to refer to all the different levels of neurodevelopmental, mental health, intellectual and other aspects that influences and affects people who live with TSC. And I like the symbol of an umbrella. I think it's a nice, simple way, and if you want to take a picture of it, you're very welcome. Isn't it funny? In the olden days, when we went to conferences, people would be looking down and making notes. These days, you see everyone kind of lifting their phones up to take pictures, but you're welcome to take pictures. This is also being recorded, so I think the TSA will probably make it available to people if anyone wants to follow it. So it's an umbrella term that summarizes the different levels that may affect people. They're all different, have different definitions, they're interrelated. And each of those levels might be affected in people with TSC. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just walk you through each of these different levels and give you some examples. So here they are. Firstly, the behavioral level, I'll talk about that, the psychiatric level, the intellectual level, the academic level, the neuropsychological level, and then the psychosocial level. And I'll come back to this picture. And here's a warning. In the afternoon session, I'm going to test you on the umbrella. And you won't be able to cheat and look at the picture you've drawn earlier or that you've taken on your phone earlier, all right? So let's start with the first one, the behavioral level. The behavioral level in the TAND language is simply the manifestations, the symptoms, the worries, the concerns that families bring to us in the clinic. Doctor, I'm worried about my sleep. I'm worried about my son's Aggression. I'm worried about my daughter's language. So these are things that we measure using things like rating scales or checklists or observing aggression or difficulties or whatever that might be. And they are not, the behavioral level is not a diagnosis. I always worry when people say, oh, that's just behavioral. What does that mean? Everything that we do is behavioral, right? So we need to understand that behavioral level. And in TSC, we know that there are very high rates of a big range of behavioral difficulties. And they include, and mums and dads and people who live with TSC will know these things: aggression, self-injury, attentional difficulties, difficulties with social communication, difficulties with mood, difficulties with sleep. And many people have many of these different behavioral challenges. Some of them correlate with your level of intellectual ability. In other words, if you have more intellectual difficulties or disability, you're more likely to have some, but not all of them. So everyone is at risk of some of these behavioral challenges. Some of them are associated with epilepsy, but there's nothing that we only see in epilepsy or that we don't see in epilepsy. So it's just a risk marker. That's why we should always look at everything in everyone with TSC. The next level is the psychiatric level. This is when you've come to the clinic saying, I'm worried about my son's inattention and I'm worried he's a bit overactive. This is when the psychiatrist will now use, or mental health professionals will use the standard ways that we have. Taking a detailed history, making some observations, using the DSM or ICD, and they're going to say, are there enough of these things? And are they there for long enough? And are they to the exclusion of other kinds of things to give a diagnosis? And there are two main groups of diagnoses, psychiatric diagnoses, that are very common in tuberous sclerosis. The first are the group of neurodevelopmental disorders, so that includes autism. And we do see autism spectrum disorders in about 40 to 50%. In about half of people with TSC will meet criteria for an autism spectrum disorder. There's a huge range, but about half will meet criteria. Almost the same proportion will meet criteria for ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Interestingly, you've already heard about autism being diagnosed late very often. ADHD is very often missed completely. People see the inattention and the overactivity, but they don't think about the possibility of a diagnosis. So when we did a study in the UK some years ago, we found that 55% of the children in our study actually met criteria for ADHD, and only one of them had received a diagnosis and treatment. The rest were just seen as, oh, that's just part of the TSC. That's just, people with TSC are overactive. And that's not helpful, because actually we know we can treat ADHD. We know we have strategies to treat things like that. So, neurodevelopmental disorders, those are the two key ones for us to look out for. The mood and anxiety disorders are the two main other psychiatric disorders that we see in tuberous sclerosis. And very high proportion of people with TSC are at risk of that. A study that Professor Julian Sampson and his colleagues did in Cardiff, they took women with people with adults with TSC, they all had completely normal intellectual ability. And they found that 60% of them met criteria for an anxiety disorder. 60%. That's enormous. And not one of them had received a diagnosis or treatment. Not a single one of them. So these things are there, but because people haven't thought to look for it, they've often been missed, not diagnosed, and therefore not treated. Interestingly, for the, particularly for the mental health experts in the room, psychotic disorders are often over-associated with some genetic disorders. So if you think about velocardiofacial syndrome, 22q11, very high rates of psychosis. In TSC, it doesn't seem to be higher than in the general population. So so the clinical message for us is when we see somebody with TSC who seems to be hearing things or be delusional or having voices or whatever, our first thought is this seizure related, rather than it's a separate psychotic disorder. Of course, there are always a small risk, but the rates are about 1% in TSC, which is the same as in the general population. So I've done behavioral level, the psychiatric level. Now we're talking about the intellectual level. So this is the level where we're going to say, what is your overall intellectual ability? And the typical way we do that is to do an IQ type test. How many of you have had an IQ test? None of the psychiatrists? They were too worried they might fail it, I'm sure. Yeah? And so when we do IQ type tests, people, children, adults you get given lots of different kinds of tasks, and then there's a way to add them all up and to see how all of us fall on what is called a normal distribution. So a normal distribution just means that it's like your height. If we take all of us and we see how tall we are, most of us would have sort of an average height, some of us would be very short, and some of us would be very tall. IQ is just the same. Most of us have average intellectual ability, and some will have lower intellectual ability, and some will have higher intellectual ability. What's the pattern in TSC?
I was told that in November 2014 that I had a very high IQ and it was within the top 20 in the world.
Good. Congratulations.
I'm so proud of.
Very good. Yes. Yeah. And so in TSC, the pattern looks, I can probably try and draw it. This normal distribution is pushed down so that that curve goes down like that. So there are more people who have intellectual disability. We define intellectual disability as when you have an IQ below 70, so you're in the bottom 2%, and when you have impairment in your daily life, in your functional skills. And so in TSC, this whole curve is pushed down a lot. And we also, and I'm going to say it carefully, we also used to see a separate big group of people that we call profoundly intellectually disabled here. But that profoundly impaired group is getting smaller and smaller and smaller in the TSC community. In part, we think it is because we're much better at picking it up early, at treating seizures better, at diagnosing it earlier, etc. So we hope that actually the curve, this pattern of distribution, might be changing in tuberous sclerosis. 21 years ago, when I started going to big TSC meetings, it was not uncommon to see many people with TSC in wheelchairs, significant mobility problems, significant, profoundly disabled, lots of facial angiofibroma. And I went to the big family conference in Dallas last year, and there was nobody in the wheelchair. And all people are taking topical rapamycin, so they all have beautiful skin, and most of their angiofibromas have gone away. And the profile of TSC, I think, is changing. And I think that's very positive for us in the TSC community. I think the world is a different place for people who live with TSC now in comparison to even 20 years ago. So I think that's important for us to hang on to from a hopeful point of view. So this pattern is moved down. So we have maybe half of people with TSC have an intellectual disability, and the other half have entirely normal intellectual ability, and many of them, such as some people in the room, can have very high intellectual ability. The challenge for us, particularly when we're psychologists, neuropsychologists, psychiatrists, are that most people have an uneven profile of intellectual skills. So if you actually look at the different subtests, the different tasks that you do, you may have found that some things, like Una talked about, you might have been incredibly good at some of those things, and then there might have been other things that were relatively much weaker. And that's hard for people to understand. Well, why are you so amazing at your memory, but you can't do maths? For instance. So I think typical is a very uneven profile. So don't just ever look at the number, the total number. Don't just ever look at the different indices. Look at the individual scatter, because that will tell you what is your child, what are his strengths and weaknesses in terms of his intellectual profile. Because all people with TSC will have strengths and weaknesses in that sense. The next level is the academic level. Different from your intellectual ability is how do you perform in school? Reading, writing, maths, those kind of things. Okay, Brona's smiling. I don't know why she's smiling. But most people with TSC, even those who have completely normal intellectual ability, even those who might have very high intellectual ability, struggle in some school stuff. The most common difficulty is maths. I don't know if that was a problem for you. Maybe you were brilliant at maths.
Strong point at school.
There you go. And you see, that's why in TSC nothing is a rule, right? There's just what is most typical. But so, and you can see here in the Tosca study, when we asked how many people had academic, scholastic difficulties, it was almost 60%. So that's incredibly high. And when we asked mums and dads, how many of your children have had additional support in school, an IEP or an IEDP, additional help, almost never does that happen. The dilemma with our systems, and I don't know if the person who is the lady who's going to talk about school support here. She'll be here later. The dilemma with our school systems is that we often wait until children fail before we do something. Isn't that terrible? Yeah? That's also what we do when we do these kind of IQ tests. We go on until you fail, but that's another story. So in TSC, because we know that 60% of people have a risk of having these difficulties, all of what we're trying to do in our guidelines is to try and be preemptive, to say we're expecting the risk, let's evaluate it, let's look for it, and then let's put things in place before it becomes too problematic. That's the way, I think, that we really shift trajectories and quality of life for people with TSC. But so here it is, very, very common. And it's so common for us to hear of kids who have very high intellectual abilities. They're in mainstream schools and they struggle academically. The way that it presents is through difficult behavior. They don't want to go to school. They become disruptive. They become aggressive. And then the focus is on that behavior rather than on thinking maybe it is because of academic difficulties that they struggle. So just to bear that in mind in our thinking and planning of their story. Behavioral, psychiatric, intellectual, academic, and now the next one is the neuropsychological level. How many of you know what the neuropsychological level is? Other than hopefully the psychiatrists will have a clue. So the neuropsychological level sounds a little bit like the intellectual one, but it's different. All our brains, as they grow up, start to develop specialization areas in different parts of the brain. And so we can actually do games, puzzles, tests to evaluate how different brain regions have emerged, developed, matured. And so we have specialization for language skills, usually on the left side of our brain. We have specialization for attentional skills, which are more in the right hemisphere. We have specialization of kind of knowledge systems in the posterior bits of the brain. We have specialization in executive skills, more in the front of our brains. And so there are ways that through neuropsychological tests and games, we can evaluate your profile. And that's much more brain specific than an IQ test, which is very general. And so in TSC, even when people have completely normal intellectual ability, even when they're in the top 20 in the world, they are at risk of having specific neuropsychological difficulties. And here are the common ones that we've identified so far. So many people with TSC have difficulties in memory, verbal and spatial, particularly in memory recall rather than recollection. Let me explain what that means. So that's if I said to you, what date did this happen? And you have to just present it, that's recall. If I said to you, which of these have you seen before? That's recognition. And they're supported by different brain regions. So many people with TSC have this kind of, I can't quite bring it out again, recall, both spatial and visual recall memories. Difficulties. Interestingly, TSC mice and rats also have memory difficulties, recall but not recognition, memory difficulties. Many people with TSC have significant problems in executive skills, planning, set shifting. Many people with TSC have significant attentional difficulties, and the most common neuropsychological deficit that we've seen of all neuropsychological difficulties in TSC are dual tasking difficulties, doing two things at the same time. So many people with TSC are good. I can do one thing, I can do the other thing, but the moment I have to combine them, there's a dramatic drop. So when we've done some studies of dual tasking, of doing two things at the same time, we found that 75% of people who have normal intellectual abilities in TSC fail those tasks. 75, that's the majority. And the way that people have described to us it makes them feel is they have a sensation of being overwhelmed. It's like my brain gets overwhelmed, it's like overloaded, and it makes them feel anxious. So that's the way most adults, able adults with TSC, describe to us. It makes me feel overwhelmed, anxious, and then I try to avoid doing this thing because I don't like that sensation. So it's a very, very common deficit that we see. So my mantra is, all men and most people with TSC have difficulties with multitasking. Okay? That's a good way to remember, all right? And then visuoconstructional. So some people also struggle doing complex visuospatial things when they have to draw things, when they have to do maps, or even map reading. That kind of complexity is often hard for many people with TSC. So I thought this is also a good time maybe just to do a little bit of a test. So I'm going to make you test one of your brain skills. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make you as a group do a test with me, all right? I'm going to show you this. Can you see all those boxes? Yeah? And what I want you to do is we're all going to read out all those numbers as a group, okay? Out loud. Are you ready? So let's just practice. So starting from this side to that side, and go.
1, 2, 2, 1, 1.
But that was super slow. Okay? Now you're going to do it as fast as you can. Are you ready? And go.
1, 2, 2, 1.
Okay, that's good. So now I'm going to show you a long list of numbers, and I want you all just to read it out as fast as you can, as a group, like a choir. Okay? Are you ready? But fast, not 1, 2. Okay, right? And go.
1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1.
And then together, stop. As a choir. And go.
1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2.
Good, that was much better. Yeah. Shall we just practice it once more in the same way? And go.
1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2.
Okay, yeah, did you all keep up? Oh my goodness, if you're struggling on this one, just wait. All right, now we're going to do the same, but this time, when you see a 1, I want you to say 2. And when you see a 2, I want you to say 1. Okay? All right? You know what we're going to do? Same speed as fast as you can. Okay? And go.
2, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2.
What's going on up there? So how did that feel doing it the reverse way? Harder? Was it easy? Yeah? So that's what we call an attentional switching task. Every time you had to say, no, not this one, the next one. No, not this one, the other one. And this is a relatively easy way to just show to you, illustrate to you. There are lots of things we can illustrate. But for many people with TSC, these kinds of things are really hard. Do we have time? Yeah, we have time for another one. I'm going to make you do another game with me. And you're not allowed to write it down. I'm going to give you numbers. And then I want you to repeat the numbers once I've said them. Okay? So, here comes the first, and I'll give you a sequence of numbers. Okay. So here come the first sequence of numbers. So listen first, and then you'll give the answer after that. 4, 2, 9. Okay?
14.
Good. Here comes the next set. 1, 3, 2, 5, 7. Okay?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7.
Good. Next one. 2, 4, 8, 9, 1, 7, 2, 5, 3, 7. Okay? Where's the answer? So why did some of you start to giggle? Because I could hear that.
Because I just got lost. I had lost.
Okay. So what if I just tested your what's called working memory? Yeah. So this is like online processing. We all hold numbers in our heads as we do things, or we see things, maps in our minds before we do. So working memory, or some people call it short-term memory, but working memory is a better term, has a limited capacity in all our brains. So for most typical adults, it's about 7. Yeah, we can normally remember about 7 numbers, or contents, or construct. And it gets better as we get older into adulthood. So I want you to imagine that in TSC, many people with TSC struggle with working memory. So imagine you have a child, and their memory span is actually only 2. Yeah? And that sensation that you had when it got over the number, what happened to it? It was, many people describe it, it's like the numbers just disappear. It's not just that you hang on to the first lot, it gets white. That's what it feels like to most of us. And so imagine you have a child or an adult with intellectual disability or somebody with working memory problems, and you say to them, go to your bedroom, and if you see your shoes on the table, then bring them down. Can you see that you might already have told your child something that they might have remembered to go to your room, and then they get there and then they go, okay, what was I supposed to do? And then they see the PlayStation and they start playing, or they start drawing, and then you say, you're such a naughty child, you should listen to your mom. But maybe it is because their working memory was simply not able to manage the demand. And so I think simple things like that can be very helpful for us, just to A, understand why people behave in certain ways, and then to help them build those skills. Can we improve working memory? Can we improve these neuropsychological skills? Yeah. Neuropsychologists, therapists, people do all sorts of games and tasks and things to expand. In fact, there's an international competition that does working memory tests. Have any of you heard of that? So there are people who compete to see who can remember the longest sequence of numbers. And people go into the hundreds. And they have techniques that they learn to build memory and working memory. So these are things that we can improve. But the key for us in TSC is it's a common difficulty. And often we miss it. And we often miss it unless we actually specifically look for these neuropsychological types of difficulties. Okay. The last bit of our umbrella is what I call the psychosocial level. This is where often mental health people and social workers are good at thinking, but in TSC often people forget about it. The impact on the individual, the trauma associated with it, the grief, the humiliation, the journey that all of us have to walk through having a diagnosis and living with it, the impact on siblings, the impact on parental relationships. TSC, and particularly if you have autism with it as well, has an incredible burden on families and on disease. And often we don't allow people a chance to talk about it. It's not that we need to have the answer, but it's about giving people permission to talk about the challenges that really is a key challenge for us. So self-esteem, people's sense of being able to do things on their own, that's called self-efficacy, family stress, how they feel and think about themselves, and many people, of course, also have resilience factors and lots of positive things that are associated with their TSC. So this is another really important domain for us to think about as part of it. So that's our umbrella: behavioral, psychiatric, intellectual, academic, neuropsychological, psychosocial. And our message is, everyone is at risk of these, but we cannot predict the individual pattern for anyone. And so that's why people should have some evaluation. And that's why when in 2012 we came up with international guidelines, we said every year each person with TSC should be screened for TAND. And by screening I mean a top-line check as opposed to a detailed evaluation. But then if you screen somebody and they say an anxiety comes out or whatever else, then you're going to do the next step and say, okay, now I'm going to do a more detailed workup to see what might be underlying this. So screen annually, and then follow up with appropriate, more detailed investigations. The screening can be done by lots of different professionals. The further detailed evaluation is often done by professionals depending on what that dilemma might be. A neuropsychologist, or a psychologist, or a psychiatrist, or a neuropsychiatrist, or whatever it may need to be. That's where it gets tricky, because we can't always find psychiatrists. But today you're going to make a WhatsApp group with these guys and get all their phone numbers, all right? Okay. And when we made this recommendation, people said to us, that's fine, we'll do it, but can you please give us some kind of a tool or some kind of a framework, because you can list all these things that are common in TSC, but most people can't. And that was the reason we then came up with this thing called the TAND Checklist. And the TAND Checklist is a very simple pen and paper tool, simple yes-no questions, 2 pages, so basically A3 folded over, takes about 10 minutes to do. And it goes through all the aspects commonly associated with TSC in exactly the way that we've just talked about them over the last 10 or 15 minutes. And it's open access, it's free. We've made it available, deliberately free to families, to professionals. And we've done some, so we published it in 2015. So you can even just go to that and we've done it. It's accessible very easily. And we did some validation. So here you can see this is the work that Lauren started to do to make sure that it captures the things that we need, that it does it in a valid way, etc. And both those papers you can access if you're interested in those. And in fact, Lauren even made me do a little movie to show how one might interview somebody using the TAND checklist as a kind of a basic schedule. I routinely, in fact, Rachel was asking me last night in the car, I always start my clinical consultations with a TAND checklist. It's just a simple way to start the conversation. And then I would go into more detailed psychiatric history, but depending on what needs to be done. And Anna Janssen, who's a pediatric neurologist in Brussels, does exactly the same. Other people have different strategies. If we have time, we can talk about how people might use it. But it really is to give you as a professional a framework to ask about the things that are common in TSC. And for you as families, also a framework to know what are the common things that I should look out for. Because common things occur commonly, even though they might be different for different people. And so this is just a little movie that I did with a mum in Cape Town who had a 6-year-old at the time with TSC. And the next thing people then ask us is, can you please translate it into other languages? And so we've started a process, and I think we've done about 15 languages so far. And we now have somebody who coordinates the translations. So we start with Dutch, then Swedish, German, Polish. We've done Catalan and Castilian, Spanish, Hungarian, Italian. We've actually now finished the French and the Japanese as well. And we're working on a bunch of others. So if you want a Gaelic version, I'm sure we can do a Gaelic version. Really to make it accessible to people. And I was actually pleased to hear that Novartis, the company that does everolimus, have recently asked if they could use the TAND checklist or some of the materials in some of their promotional materials as well. So that's a way of also helping them to spread the message about the use of it. This is the only TSC specific checklist, but you don't have to use it. And we make it free, so nobody makes money out of it anyway. But the goal is to make people think about TAND issues. Many clinicians around the world, until recently, have thought that if they've figured out the skin and the kidney and the brain and the heart and the lungs and the epilepsy, they've done a good job. My message, and the message we're trying to give to people, is that is the beginning. Once you've done all those things, now we come on to the things that are actually the most challenging and the hardest and the greatest burden on family and individual lives are these TAND challenges that so far people have really not paid a lot of attention to. And I'm completely off track now, but just listening, and I don't want to use you, Brenna, too much as an example, but we recently did some meetings in Australia, and there was a young adult with TSC who had normal intellectual ability. He was working, he was functioning very well in many ways, and he stood up in the conversation and he said, I just want to say that all through my life people have said to me that I'm mildly affected by TSC. But I don't like the word mildly affected, because I have actually been profoundly affected by TSC. All the mental health, all the learning, all the academic, all the getting jobs and keeping jobs issues have profoundly affected my life. So please don't call me mildly affected. Isn't that interesting? And so I said to him, I promise I will never call you mildly or anyone else mildly affected, because each of us are profoundly affected in our own way. And that's what we need to focus on, I think. And so we're going to screen, and then we recommend, given that we want to catch things early and do interventions as early as we can, we also say we recommend that across all these TAND levels, at key developmental time points, people should have a much more comprehensive assessment. In infancy, toddler years, so that we can pick up those intellectual disability and autism early if we can, and we get ready for preschool. In preschool years, so that we can really start to look at their profile to plan for school entry. In the primary years, so that we can think what might you need for secondary transition, because some of these characteristics come online over time. In secondary years for transition into adult life, and then in the first 5 or so years of adult life. The most difficult time for most people with TSC is the transition from school into adult life, because we know healthcare systems are relatively good while you're under the age of 18, but that transition to adult life and independence, your healthcare system changes, the support systems change significantly, the expectation from society is very different, the resources are different. So that's why we've added a very deliberate extra box for adult life, because that's often many people with TSC who've managed to get through, suddenly they find themselves really struggling in those 20 to 25 year age group. And that's why it's there. The third recommendation is we should do an urgent assessment of somebody when there's rapid or sudden change in their TAND profile. And you will know what it is. Mums and dads and people who live with TSC will know, is this different from usual? If there's a sudden change. My child was usually very interested in pop music or Princess Elsa from Frozen, and suddenly they've lost interest very rapidly. Then we're going to think, well, what does this mean? Or they were absolutely fine and suddenly they become aggressive. Or they had no problems and rapidly there was an onset of strange behaviors that we haven't seen before. Those are all triggers for thinking, is there something biological? Is there something going on in the brain or in the body system that has led to those? Because we know our bodies and our minds are closely connected. And so what we're saying, if there's rapid change, look for, think, is there infection? Is there kidney stuff? Are there medication side effects? Are there seizure changes? Is it a growing SAGA? An example that I often use because it was just such a striking example. A 15-year-old boy, mainstream school, he did well academically. He had never had any major challenges. And then suddenly, over a period of a month or so, he started to become super aggressive in school. Started, beating up the other kids, being aggressive, swearing at the teachers. Once he even kicked a teacher. And so they expelled him from school. And they said, this is a teenager with difficult behaviors, we can't tolerate that, zero tolerance for difficult behaviors. And of course, he came to us in the clinic, and when we heard the story, we said, well, that's very atypical. And Mum and Dad said, he's never been like this before. And so what we did is we did a brain scan, and he had a SAGA. So he had a growing SAGA, and the aggression was a symptom of his growing SAGA. And so the treatment for his aggression was a SAGA surgery. That was before the days of everolimus. And within about 6 months, he was able to go back to school, and he was fine. So just to bear that in mind, the manifestations of physical symptoms in TSC can be aggression, can be sleep disturbance, can be mood disorders, can be all these kinds of things. And that's why we need to bear the whole picture in mind with everything we do. So let me just talk in the last 5 minutes just about some of the TSC research that we're doing in TAND. I'll talk a bit more later. And I could talk for a long time about this, but I thought I'd just give 2 examples. The first is, can we find natural clusters of TAND? And I'll tell you in a minute why. And the second is, can we actually use mTOR inhibitors like everolimus to treat TAND manifestations? So let's go to the first one first. I've just illustrated to you all the possible things that can happen in TAND in people with TSC. And many families and many doctors come and say, well, that's all a little bit overwhelming. I have no idea. There's so many unique combinations of things. What do we do? And what we realized is actually that led to a term we call treatment paralysis. The doctors, even specialists, would say, oh my God, I have no idea what to do. Let's just do nothing and hope it goes away. Rather than to try and work through systematically. And so we wanted to ask a simple question based on literature from other conditions. Maybe if we could find a small number of clusters of these things, it would make it easier for clinicians and for us as people who live with TSC to look for this cluster and to try to find treatment for this cluster. And our idea, and this was Lauren's project, was if we could find fewer than 10 clusters, we thought most doctors can count up to 10. So we thought if we can get it 10 or fewer, that would be really cool. But of course, we couldn't predict what would happen. And very simply, what we did, we used a data-driven approach. So you can, in psychiatry, all the boxes we use are things we've made up over the decades and the centuries. But these days we have technology that we can take data from people, we can take what you tell us, and put it in computers and see how they group naturally. And that's what Lauren did in her PhD project. And so she ended up firstly doing a little study to see can we find a method, and then she took almost 500 people with TSC from a number of different countries. We gave all of them a TAND checklist to complete, and then she used cluster analysis techniques to see can we find clusters. What do you think happened? Did it work or was it a disaster? It actually worked. And what was very interesting for us is that we were able to find of all the complex things in TSC, 7 clusters, 7 natural groupings of TAND manifestations. And I'm quickly going to show you what they are because we'll talk more about it after lunch. So we saw a cluster, very clear, separate from all the others, of all these academic things, reading, writing, spelling, maths, separate from all the others. We saw an overactivity, restlessness, impulsivity cluster, separate from all the others. Then we saw that neuropsychological cluster that I talked about, attention difficulties, memory difficulties, executive stuff, visuospatial, separate, or fairly separate, overlapping a little bit with some other things. We saw a very clear aggression and temper tantrum cluster. We saw a very clear mood and anxiety cluster. We saw an eating and sleeping cluster. And then we had a big messy group that really, this orange group, are all the autism-related language, eye contact, rigidity, repetitive behavior, self-injury kind of thing. So neuropsych cluster, an ASD cluster, what we call dysregulated behavior cluster, an eating, sleeping, a mood, academic, and an overactivity, impulsivity cluster. So that's interesting for us, and what we hope, and I'll use this example after lunch, is that we can now say to people, go and look for these 7 things. It sounds more manageable, doesn't it, in a way, rather than go and look for 1 million possible things. And what we want to do, and I'll give you an example, is then to say, so how can we use it? So these are, for the kind of, if there are any data experts in the room, we can actually build a tree. So here you can see, this is how they group. So all the kind of sleep and eating things group together, the aggression and group together, the impulsivity group together, the academic things, etc. And what we want to do, our fantasy, is we want to be able to say, once we can help you identify your cluster, can we find specific tools or specific next steps or interventions for that cluster? And our super fantasy is we want to develop an app that you can fill in the TAND checklist on your own, and automatically it'll score up your checklist and it'll pop up the clusters, and you can click on the cluster and it'll tell you what you can do as the next step. It's not going to replace the psychiatrist, you're just going to get more people come to you. But then the hope is that they'll be more targeted, and somebody might say, I have, and I'll give you the examples, but I have significant issues in the mood cluster, or I have significant issues in the inattention cluster, or whatever. So that's our fantasy about the TAND checklist and next steps with the TAND checklist. Can we use mTOR inhibitors like everolimus to treat TAND? What are your thoughts? Those of you who are taking or family members who are using everolimus. What do you think?
I was on that
Yeah.
It's quite
Yeah. Yeah. And so many people describe that when they're on very high doses of the medication, they get many side effects. And what we're finding increasingly in TSC is you often need much lower doses to still have the positive benefits on your brain, your skin, your kidney, and potentially the TAND. So the reason why we are interested in can it do something to TAND as well is actually a mechanistic one, a biological one. Here you can see, and Rachel didn't show you this picture, there's TSC1 and TSC2. She mentioned the two proteins. Don't worry about what the picture looks like. It's not to scare you. But the TSC proteins inside every cell of our bodies talk to this protein called mTOR, the mammalian target of rapamycin. And when you have TSC, you have too much of this guy, and that's why we block it with an mTOR inhibitor. But you can see, and the main reason, the main job that the pathway does is to regulate cell growth and proliferation. So the skin tumors and the brain tumors and all this are because there's too much growth of cells in the body. But this same pathway also is involved in things like long-term potentiation and synaptic plasticity. So long-term potentiation is the way that our brains lay down memories and remember things. It's also the pathway that's involved in myelination, that's making the white matter tracks in our brain. So those are like the highways that send messages. And it's also involved in development of the brain. So there are many brain-based processes that are also in this pathway. So we argue that if this is dysregulated, if you have TSC, not only do you have the physical manifestations, but it also dysregulates many of your brain functions. So the question is, can we, if we give you rapamycin or everolimus, can it also improve some of these kind of things? And so there's been some animal studies. I don't know if any of you have met a mouse with TSC, but there are some mice with TSC. There are rats with TSC as well. And the rats and the mice with TSC have memory problems, and they have learning problems, and they have attentional problems. And what they found is when they gave them everolimus, those memory problems actually went away. And that was very exciting. That led to some of the early phase studies we've done. So we've done a little study where we looked at memory in people with TSC, and it looked as though it made improved memory. And recently there's been two studies, one in Boston and Cincinnati that we did with younger people. The finding of that study was basically, it was mixed. Some people went up, some went down, some went left, some went right. So we don't quite know what that study is telling us. And we're still trying to figure it out. But we also, and we finished that last year in Cardiff in the UK, and some of you might have been part of that study where we gave everolimus to adults with TSC and looked at their memory, anxiety, attention, autism, and so on. And what we found was actually very interesting. We found that even the people on placebo, so some people got the sugar tablet and some got the real everolimus, even people on placebo had significant improvement in many of their memory and learning and attentional aspects, so almost 40%. And what's important about that is that tells us, that gives us evidence that just having predictability, knowing what you've seen before, knowing what is expected, makes a massive difference to our ability to incorporate information and lay it down. So for us, the clinical thing, that's why you guys who work with families and with people with TSC try to give predictability, structure, routine, because it makes the brain accessible to learning. And so that's what the study showed, at least in part. And then interestingly, the group who had everolimus, over 70% of people in the everolimus group showed significant improvements in their memory and learning. And so that's an early sign that I think it tells us that everolimus may well have a role to improve not just the physical manifestations of TSC, but might also improve some of those neuropsychiatric TAND manifestations. At the moment, we're not going to say go out and use it, but at least what it tells us that if you are taking it for your kidney and your brain tumor or your skin, it may also over time have a positive impact on your neuropsychiatric manifestations. You need to manage side effects. If you get side effects, you have to manage those first. But over time, that is what we see in the majority of people with TSC. So that's what I wanted to do. Why TAND, what it is, the checklist, a bit about some of the research. When we come back, so we're going to have Do we have tea now?
Yes, we have tea now.
Tea now, then we come back for more talks, and then when we come back after lunch, I'm going to use the TAND checklist to see how might we be able to use it in real life to think about what might be my difficulty and what can I do as the next step. So I hope that was a useful introduction for everyone. Thank you, Patrick. I shall hand back the mic to you.